Matthew Henry's Commentary on the Whole Bible. 2 Kings 17. This chapter gives us an account of the captivity of the 10 tribes, and so finishes the history of that kingdom, after it had continued about 265 years, from the setting up of Jeroboam the son of Nebat. In it we have 1. A short narrative of this destruction, verses 1 to 6. 2. Remarks upon it and the causes of it, for the justifying of God in it and for warning to others, verses 7 to 23. 3. An account of the nations which succeeded them in the possession of their land, and the mongrel religion set up among them, verses 24 to 41. Samaria besieged by the Assyrians, Israel subdued by Assyria, 730 BC. 1. In the 12th year of Ahaz king of Judah began Hoshea the son of Elah to reign in Samaria over Israel 9 years. 2. And he did that which was evil in the sight of the Lord, but not as the kings of Israel that were before him. 3. Against him came up Shalmaneser king of Assyria, and Hoshea became his servant, and gave him presents. 4. And the king of Assyria found conspiracy in Hoshea, for he had sent messengers to So king of Egypt, and brought no present to the king of Assyria, as he had done year by year. Therefore the king of Assyria shut him up, and bound him in prison. 5. Then the king of Assyria came up throughout all the land, and went up to Samaria, and besieged it 3 years. 6. In the 9th year of Hoshea the king of Assyria took Samaria, and carried Israel away into Assyria, and placed them in Hala, and in Habor by the river of Gozan, and in the cities of the Medes. We have here the reign and ruin of Hoshea, the last of the kings of Israel, concerning whom observe. 1. That, though he forced his way to the crown by treason and murder, as we read chapter 15 verse 30, yet he gained not the possession of it till 7 or 8 years after, for it was in the 4th year of Ahaz that he slew Pekah, but did not himself begin to reign till the 12th year of Ahaz, verse 1. Whether by the king of Assyria, or by the king of Judah, or by some of his own people, does not appear, but it seems so long he was kept out of the throne he aimed at. Justly were his bad practices thus chastised, and the word of the prophet was thus fulfilled, Hosea 10 verse 3, Now they shall say we have no king, because we feared not the Lord. 2. That, though he was bad, yet not so bad as the kings of Israel had been before him, verse 2, not so devoted to the calves as they had been. 1 of them, that at Dan, the Jews say, had been, before this, carried away by the king of Assyria in the expedition recorded chapter 15 verse 29, to which perhaps the prophet refers, Hosea 8 verse 5, Thy calf, O Samaria, has cast thee off, which made him put the less confidence in the other. And some say that this Hoshea took off the embargo which the former kings had put their subjects under, forbidding them to go up to Jerusalem to worship, which he permitted those to do that had a mind to it. But what shall we think of this dispensation of providence, that the destruction of the kingdom of Israel should come in the reign of one of the best of its kings? Thy judgments, O God, are a great deep. God would hereby show that in bringing this ruin upon them he designed to punish 1. Not only the sins of that generation, but of the foregoing ages, and to reckon for the iniquities of their fathers, who had been long in filing the measure and treasuring up wrath against this day of wrath. 2. Not only the sins of their kings, but the sins of the people. If Hoshea was not so bad as the former kings, yet the people were as bad as those that went before them, and it was an aggravation of their badness, and brought ruin the sooner, that their king did not set them so bad an example as the former kings had done, nor hinder them from reforming. He gave them leave to do better, but they did as bad as ever, which laid the blame of their sin and ruin wholly upon themselves. 3. That the destruction came gradually. They were for some time made tributaries before they were made captives to the king of Assyria, verse 3, and, if that less judgment had prevailed to humble and reform them, the greater would have been prevented. 4. That they brought it upon themselves by the indirect course they took to shake off the yoke of the king of Assyria, verse 4. Had the king and people of Israel applied to God, made their peace with him, and their prayers to him, they might have recovered their liberty, ease and honor, but they withheld their tribute, and trusted to the king of Egypt to assist them in their revolt, which, if it had taken effect, would have been but to change their oppressors. But Egypt became to them the staff of a broken reed. This provoked the king of Assyria to proceed against them with the more severity. Men get nothing by struggling with the net, but entangle themselves the more. That it was an utter destruction that came upon them. 1. The king of Israel was made a prisoner, he was shut up and bound, being, it is probable, taken by surprise, before Samaria was besieged. 2. The land of Israel was made a prey. The army of the king of Assyria came up throughout all the land, made themselves master of it, verse 5, and treated the people as traitors to be punished with the sword of justice rather than as fair enemies. 3. The royal city of Israel was besieged, and at length taken. 3 years it held out after the country was conquered, and no doubt a great deal of misery was endured at that time which is not particularly recorded, but the brevity of the story, and the passing of this matter over lightly, methinks, intimate that they were abandoned of God, and he did not now regard the affliction of Israel, as sometimes as he had done. 4. The people of Israel were carried captives into Assyria, verse 6. The generality of the people, those that were of any note, were forced away into the conqueror's country, to be slaves and beggars there. 1. Thus he was pleased to exercise a dominion over them, and to show that they were entirely at his disposal. 2. By depriving them of their possessions and estates, real and personal, and exposing them to all the hardships and reproaches of a removal to a strange country, under the power of an imperious army, he chastised them for their rebellion and their endeavor to shake off his yoke. 3. Thus he effectually prevented all such attempts for the future and secured their country to himself. 4. Thus he got the benefit of their service in his own country, as Pharaoh did that of their fathers, and so this unworthy people were lost as they were found, and ended as they began, in servitude and under oppression. 5. Thus he made room for those of his own country that had little to do, at home, to settle in a good land, a land flowing with milk and honey. In all these several ways he served himself by this captivity of the 10 tribes. We are here told in what places of his kingdom he disposed of them in Hala and Habor, in places, we may suppose, far distant from each other, lest they should keep up a correspondence, incorporate again, and become formidable. There, we have reason to think, after some time they were so mingled with the nations that they were lost, and the name of Israel was no more in remembrance. Those that forgot God were themselves forgotten, those that studied to be like the nations were buried among them, and those that would not serve God in their own land were made to serve their enemies in a strange land. It is probable that they were the men of honor and estates who were carried captive, and that many of the meaner sort of people were left behind, many of every tribe, who either went over to Judah, or became subject to the Assyrian colonies, and their posterity were Galileans or Samaritans. But thus ended Israel as a nation. Now they became Lo-Ammi not a people, and Lo-Ruhamah unpitied. Now Canaan spurred them out. When we read of their entry under Hoshea the son of Nun, who would have thought that such as this should be their exit under Hoshea the son of Elah? Thus Rome's glory in Augustus sunk, many ages after, in Augustulus. Providence so ordered the eclipsing of the honor of the 10 tribes that the honor of Judah, the royal tribe, and Levi, the holy tribe, which yet remained, might shine the brighter. Yet we find a number sealed of every one of the 12 tribes, Revelation 7. Except Dan, James writes to the 12 tribes scattered abroad, James 1 verse 1, and Paul speaks of the 12 tribes which instantly served God day and night, Acts 26 verse 7, so that though we never read of those that were carried captive, nor have any reason to credit the conjecture of some, that they yet remain a distinct body in some remote corner of the world, yet a remnant of them did escape, to keep up the name of Israel, till it came to be worn by the gospel church, the spiritual Israel in which it will ever remain, Galatians 6 verse 16. The wickedness of Israel, 730 BC. 7 For so it was, that the children of Israel had sinned against the Lord their God, which had brought them up out of the land of Egypt, from under the hand of Pharaoh king of Egypt, and had feared other gods, ate and walked in the statutes of the heathen, whom the Lord cast out from before the children of Israel, and of the kings of Israel, which they had made. 9 And the children of Israel did secretly those things that were not right against the Lord their God, and they built them high places in all their cities, from the tower of the watchman to the fenced city. 10 And they set them up images and groves in every high hill, and under every green tree. 11 And there they burnt incense in all the high places, as did the heathen whom the Lord carried away before them, and wrought wicked things to provoke the Lord to anger. 12 For they served idols, whereof the Lord had said unto them, Ye shall not do this thing. 13 Yet the Lord testified against Israel and against Judah, by all the prophets, and by all the seers, saying, Turn ye from your evil ways, and keep my commandments and my statutes, according to all the law which I commanded your fathers, and which I sent to you by my servants the prophets. 14 Notwithstanding they would not hear, but hardened their necks, like to the neck of their fathers, that did not believe in the Lord their God. 15 And they rejected his statutes, and his covenant that he made with their fathers, and his testimonies which he testified against them, and they followed vanity, and became vain, and went after the heathen that were round about them, concerning whom the Lord had charged them, that they should not do like them. 16 And they left all the commandments of the Lord their God, and made them molten images, even 2 calves, and made a grove, and worshipped all the host of heaven, and served Baal. 17 And they caused their sons and their daughters to pass through the fire, and used divination and enchantments, and sold themselves to do evil in the sight of the Lord, to provoke him to anger. 18 Therefore the Lord was very angry with Israel, and removed them out of his sight. There was none left, but the tribe of Judah only. 19 Also Judah kept not the commandments of the Lord their God, but walked in the statutes of Israel which they made. 20 And the Lord rejected all the seed of Israel, and afflicted them, and delivered them into the hand of spoilers, until he had cast them out of his sight. 21 For he rent Israel from the house of David, and they made Jeroboam the son of Nebat king, and Jeroboam drave Israel from following the Lord, and made them sin a great sin. 22 For the children of Israel walked in all the sins of Jeroboam which he did, they departed not from them. 23 Until the Lord removed Israel out of his sight, as he had said by all his servants the prophets. So was Israel carried away out of their own land to Assyria unto this day. Though the destruction of the kingdom of the 10 tribes was but briefly related, it is in these verses largely commented upon by our historian, and the reasons of it assigned, not taken from the second causes the weakness of Israel, their impolitic management, and the strength and growing greatness of the Assyrian monarch. These things are overlooked, but only from the first cause. Observe, 1. It was the Lord that removed Israel out of his sight. Whoever were the instruments, he was the author of this calamity. It was destruction from the Almighty. The Assyrian was but the rod of his anger, Isaiah 10 verse 5. It was the Lord that rejected the seed of Israel, else their enemies could not have seized upon them, verse 20. Who gave Jacob for a spoil, and Israel to the robbers? Did not the Lord? Isaiah 43 verse 24. We lose the benefit of national judgments if we do not eye the hand of God in them, and the fulfilling of the Scripture, for that also is taken notice of here. Verse 23 The Lord removed Israel out of his favor, and out of their own land, as he had said by all his servants the prophets. Rather shall heaven and earth pass than one tittle of God's word fall to the ground. When God's word and his works are compared, it will be found not only that they agree, but that they illustrate each other. But why would God ruin a people that were raised and incorporated, as Israel was, by miracles and oracles? Why would he undo that which he himself had done at so vast an expense? Was it purely an act of sovereignty? No, it was an act of necessary justice. 4:2. They provoked him to do this by their wickedness. Was it God's doing? Nay, it was their own. By their way and their doings they procured all this to themselves, and it was their own wickedness that did correct them. This the sacred historian shows here at large, that it might appear that God did them no wrong, and that others might hear and fear. Come and see what it was that did all this mischief, that broke their power and laid their honor in the dust. It was sin that, and nothing else, separated between them and God. This is here very movingly laid open as the cause of all the desolations of Israel. He here shows 1. What God had done for Israel, to engage them to serve him. 1. He gave them their liberty. Verse 7 He brought them from under the hand of Pharaoh, who oppressed them, asserted their freedom, Israel is my son, and effected their freedom with a high hand. Thus they were bound in duty and gratitude to be his servants, for he had loosed their bonds, nor would he that rescued them out of the hand of the king of Egypt have contradicted himself so far as to deliver them into the hand of the king of Assyria, as he did, if they had not, by their iniquity, betrayed their liberty, and sold themselves. 2. He gave them their law, and was himself their king. They were immediately under a divine regimen. They could not plead ignorance of good and evil, sin and duty, for God had particularly charged them against those very things which here he charges them with, verse 15, that they should not do like the heathen. Nor could they be in any doubt concerning their obligation to observe the laws which they are here charged with rejecting, for they were the commandments and statutes of the Lord their God, verse 13, so that no room was left to dispute whether they should keep them or no. He had not dealt so with other nations, Psalm 147 verses 19 and 20. 3. He gave them their land, for he cast out the heathen from before them, verse 8, to make room for them, and the casting out of them for their idolatries was as fair a warning as could be given to Israel not to do like them. 2. What they had done against God, notwithstanding these engagements which he had laid upon them. 1. In general, they sinned against the Lord their God, verse 7, they did those things that were not right, verse 9, but secretly. So wedded were they to their evil practices that when they could not do them publicly, could not for shame, or could not for fear, they would do them secretly in evidence of their atheism, that they thought what was done in secret was from under the eye of God himself, and would not be required. Again, they wrought wicked things in such a direct contradiction to the divine law, that they seemed as if they were done on purpose to provoke the Lord to anger, verse 11, in contempt of his authority and defiance of his justice. They rejected God's statutes and his covenant, verse 15, would not be bound up either by his command or the consent they themselves had given to the covenant, but threw off the obligations of both, and therefore God justly rejected them, verse 20. See Hosea 4 verse 6. They left all the commandments of the Lord their God, verse 16, left the way, left the work, which those commandments prescribed them and directed them in. Nay, lastly, they sold themselves to do evil in the sight of the Lord, that is, they wholly addicted themselves to sin, as slaves to the service of those to whom they are sold, and, by their obstinately persisting in sin, so hardened their own hearts that at length it had become morally impossible for them to recover themselves, as one that has sold himself has put his liberty past recall. 2. In particular, though they were guilty, no doubt, of many immoralities, and violated all the commands of the second table, yet nothing is here specified, but their idolatry. This was the sin that did most easily beset them. This was, of all sins, most provoking to God. It was the spiritual adultery that broke the marriage covenant, and was the inlet of all other wickedness. Hence it is again and again mentioned here as the sin that ruined them. 1. They feared other gods, verse 7, that is, worshipped them, and paid their homage to them, as if they feared their displeasure. 2. They walked in the statutes of the heathen, which were contrary to God's statutes, verse 8, did as did the heathen, verse 11, went after the heathen that were round about them, verse 15, so prostituting the honor of their peculiarity, and defeating God's design concerning them, which was that they should be distinguished from the heathen. Must those that were taught of God go to school to the heathen? Those that were appropriated to God take their measures from the nations that were abandoned by him? 3. They walked in the statutes of the idolatrous kings of Israel, verse 8, in all the sins of Jeroboam, verse 22. When their kings assumed a power to alter and add to the divine institutions, they submitted to them, and thought the command of their kings would bear them out in disobedience to the command of their God. 4. They built themselves high places in all their cities, verse 9. If in any place there was but the tower of the watchman, a country tower that had no walls, but only a tower to shelter the watch in time of danger, or but a lodge for shepherds, it must be honored with a high place, and that with an altar. If there was a fenced city, it must be further fortified with a high place. Having forsaken God's only place, they knew no end of high places, in which every man followed his own fancy, and directed his devotion to what God he pleased. Sacred things were hereby profaned and laid common, when their altars were as heaps in the furrows of the field, Hosea 12 verse 11. 5. They set them up images in groves Asherim, even wooden images, so some think the term, which we translate groves, should be rendered, or Ashtaroth, so others, directed contrary to the second commandment, verse 10. They served idols, verse 12, the works of their own hands and creatures of their own fancy, though God had warned them particularly not to do this thing. 6. They burnt incense in all the high places, to the honor of strange gods, for it was to the dishonor of the true God, verse 11. 7. They followed vanity. Idols are called so, because they could do neither good nor evil, but were the most insignificant things that could be. Those that worshipped them were like unto them, and so they became vain and good for nothing. Verse 16, vain in their devotions, which were brutish and ridiculous, and so became vain in their whole conversation. 8. Besides the molten images, even the two calves, they worshipped all the host of heaven, the sun, moon, and stars, for it is not meant of the heavenly host of angels. They could not rise so far above sensible things as to think of them. And, withal, they served Baal, the deified heroes of the Gentiles. Verse 16. 9. They caused their children to pass through the fire, in token of their dedicating them to their idols. 10. They used divinations and enchantments, that they might receive directions from the gods to whom they paid their devotions. 3. What means God used with them? To bring them off from their idolatries, and to how little purpose. He testified against them, showed them their sins, and warned them of the fatal consequences of them by all the prophets and all the seers, for so the prophets had been formerly called, and pressed them to turn from their evil ways. Verse 13. We have read of prophets, more or less, in every reign. Though they had forsaken God's family of priests, he did not leave them without a succession of prophets, who made it their business to teach them the good knowledge of the Lord, but all in vain. Verse 14, they would not hear, but hardened their necks, persisted in their idolatries, and were like their fathers, that would not bow their necks to God's yoke, because they did not believe in him, did not receive his truths, nor would venture upon his promises. It seems to refer to their fathers in the wilderness. The same sin that kept them out of Canaan turned these out, and that was unbelief. 4. How God punished them for their sins. He was very angry with them. Verse 18, for, in the matter of his worship, he is a jealous God, and resents nothing more deeply than giving that honor to any creature which is due to himself only. He afflicted them, verse 20, and delivered them into the hand of spoilers, in the days of the judges and of Saul, and afterwards in the days of most of their kings, to see if they would be awakened by the judgments of God to consider and amend their ways. But, when all these corrections did not prevail to drive out the folly, God first rent Israel from the house of David, under which they might have been happy. As Judah was hereby weakened, so Israel was hereby corrupted, for they made a man king who drove them from following the Lord and caused them to sin a great sin. Verse 21. This was a national judgment, and the punishment of their former idolatries, and, at length, he removed them quite out of his sight. Verses 18 and 23, without giving them any hopes of a return out of their captivity. Lastly, here is a complaint against Judah in the midst of all. Verse 19 also Judah kept not the commandments of God, though they were not as yet quite so bad as Israel, yet they walked in the statutes of Israel, and this aggravated the sin of Israel, that they communicated the infection of it to Judah. See Ezekiel 23 verse 11. Those that bring sin into a country or family bring a plague into it, and will have to answer for all the mischief that follows. The Samaritans' idolatry, 720 BC. 24 And the king of Assyria brought men from Babylon, and from Cutha, and from Ava, and from Hamath, and from Sepharvaim, and placed them in the cities of Samaria instead of the children of Israel, and they possessed Samaria, and dwelt in the cities thereof. 25 And so it was at the beginning of their dwelling there, that they feared not the Lord, therefore the Lord sent lions among them, which slew some of them. 26 Wherefore they spake to the king of Assyria, saying, the nations which thou hast removed, and placed in the cities of Samaria, know not the manner of the God of the land, therefore he hath sent lions among them, and, behold, they slay them, because they know not the manner of the God of the land. 27 Then the king of Assyria commanded, saying, carry thither one of the priests whom ye brought from thence, and let them go and dwell there, and let him teach them the manner of the God of the land. 28 Then one of the priests whom they had carried away from Samaria came and dwelt in Bethel, and taught them how they should fear the Lord. 29 Howbeit every nation made gods of their own, and put them in the houses of the high places which the Samaritans had made, every nation in their cities wherein they dwelt. 30 And the men of Babylon made Sukkot-Benoth, and the men of Cuth made Nergal, and the men of Hamath made Ashima. 31 And the Avites made Nibas and Tartak, and the Sepharvites burnt their children in fire to Adramelech and Anamelech, the gods of Sepharvaim. 32 So they feared the Lord, and made unto themselves of the lowest of them priests of the high places, which sacrificed for them in the houses of the high places. 33 They feared the Lord, and served their own gods, after the manner of the nations whom they carried away from thence. 34 Unto this day they do after the former manners, they fear not the Lord, neither do they after their statutes, or after their ordinances, or after the law and commandment which the Lord commanded the children of Jacob, whom he named Israel. 35 With whom the Lord had made a covenant, and charged them, saying, Ye shall not fear other gods, nor bow yourselves to them, nor serve them, nor sacrifice to them. 36 But the Lord, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt with great power and a stretched out arm, him shall ye fear, and him shall ye worship, and to him shall ye do sacrifice. 37 And the statutes, and the ordinances, and the law, and the commandment, which he wrote for you, ye shall observe to do forevermore, and ye shall not fear other gods. 38 And the covenant that I have made with you ye shall not forget, neither shall ye fear other gods. 39 But the Lord your God ye shall fear, and he shall deliver you out of the hand of all your enemies. 40 Howbeit they did not hearken, but they did after their former manner. 41 So these nations feared the Lord, and served their graven images, both their children, and their children's children, as did their fathers, so do they unto this day. Never was land lost, we say, for want of an heir. When the children of Israel were dispossessed, and turned out of Canaan, the king of Assyria soon transplanted thither the supernumeraries of his own country, such as it could well spare, who should be servants to him and masters to the Israelites that remained. And here we have an account of these new inhabitants, whose story is related here that we may take our leave of Samaria, as also of the Israelites that were carried captive into Assyria. 1. Concerning the Assyrians that were brought into the land of Israel we are here told, 1. That they possessed Samaria and dwelt in the cities thereof, verse 24. It is common for lands to change their owners, but sad that the Holy Land should become a heathen land again. See what work sin makes. 2. That at their first coming God sent lions among them. They were probably insufficient to people the country, which occasioned the beasts of the field to multiply against them, Exodus 23 verse 29, yet, besides the natural cause, there was a manifest hand of God in it, who is Lord of hosts, of all the creatures, and can serve his own purposes by which he pleases, small or great, lice or lions. God ordered them this rough welcome to check their pride and insolence, and to let them know that though they had conquered Israel, the God of Israel had power enough to deal with them, that he could have prevented their settling here, by ordering lions into the service of Israel, and that he permitted it, not for their righteousness, but the wickedness of his own people, and that they were now under his visitation. They had lived without God in their own land, and were not plagued with lions, but, if they do so in this land, it is at their peril. 3. That they sent a remonstrance of this grievance to the king their master, setting forth, it is likely, the loss their infant colony had sustained by the lions and the continual fear they were in of them, and stating that they looked upon it to be a judgment upon them for not worshipping the God of the land, which they could not, because they knew not how. Verse 26. The God of Israel was the God of the whole world, but they ignorantly call him the God of the land, apprehending themselves therefore within his reach, and concerned to be upon good terms with him. Herein they shamed the Israelites, who were not so ready to hear the voice of God's judgments as they were, and who had not served the God of that land, though he was the God of their fathers, and their great benefactor, and though they were well instructed in the manner of his worship. Assyrians begged to be taught that which Israelites hated to be taught. 4. That the king of Assyria took care to have them taught the manner of the God of the land, verses 27 and 28, not out of any affection to that God, but to save his subjects from the lions. On this errand he sent back one of the priests whom he had carried away captive. A prophet would have done them more good, for this was but one of the priests of the calves, and therefore chose to dwell at Bethel for old acquaintance sake, and, though he might teach them to do better than they did, he was not likely to teach them to do well, unless he had taught his own people better. However, he came and dwelt among them, to teach them how they should fear the Lord. Whether he taught them out of the book of the law, or only by word of mouth, is uncertain. 5. That, being thus taught, they made a mongrel religion of it, worshipped the God of Israel for fear, and their own idols for love. Verse 33. They feared the Lord, but they served their own gods. They all agreed to worship the God of the land according to the manner, to serve the Jewish festivals and rites of sacrificing, but every nation made gods of their own besides, not only for their private use in their own families, but to be put in the houses of their high places. Verse 9. The idols of each country are here named, verses 30 and 31. The learned are at a loss for the signification of several of these names, and cannot agree by what representations these gods were worshipped. If we may credit the traditions of the Jewish doctors, they tell us that Sukkot was worshipped in a hen and chickens, Nergal in a cock, a Shema in a smooth goat, Nibaz in a dog, Tartak in an ass, a Dramelech in a peacock, an Amalek in a pheasant. Our own tell us, more probably, that Sukkot, signifying the tents of the daughters, was Venus. Nergal, being worshipped by the Cuthites or Persians, was the fire. A Dramelech and an Amalek were only distinctions of Moloch. See how vain idolaters were in their imaginations, and wonder at their sottishness. Our very ignorance concerning these idols teaches us the accomplishment of that word which God has spoken, that these false gods should all perish. Jeremiah 10 verse 11, they are all buried in oblivion, while the name of the true God shall continue forever. 6. This medley superstition is here said to continue unto this day, verse 41, till the time when this book was written, and long after, above 300 years in all, till the time of Alexander the Great, when Manasseh, brother to Jadis the high priest of the Jews, having married the daughter of Sanballat, governor of the Samaritans, went over to them, got leave of Alexander to build a temple in Mount Gerizim, drew over many of the Jews to him, and prevailed with the Samaritans to cast away all their idols and to worship the God of Israel only. Yet their worship was mixed with so much superstition that our Savior told them they knew not what they worshipped. John 4 verse 22. 2. Concerning the Israelites that were carried into the land of Assyria. This historian has occasion to speak of them, verse 22, showing that their successors in the land did as they had done, after the manner of the nations whom they carried away. They worshipped both the God of Israel and those other gods. But what did the captives do in the land of their affliction? Were they reformed and brought to repentance by their troubles? No, they did after the former manner, verse 34. When the two tribes were afterwards carried into Babylon, they were cured by it of their idolatry, and therefore, after 70 years, they were brought back with joy. But the 10 tribes were hardened in the furnace, and therefore were justly lost in it and left to perish. This obstinacy of theirs is here aggravated by the consideration 1. Of the honor God had put upon them, as the seed of Jacob, whom he named Israel, and from him they were so named, but were a reproach to that worthy name by which they were called. 2. Of the covenant he made with them, and the charge he gave them upon that covenant, which is here very fully recited, that they should fear and serve the Lord Jehovah only, who had brought them up out of Egypt. Verse 36, that, having received his statutes and ordinances in writing, they should observe to do them forevermore. Verse 37, and never forget that covenant which God had made with them, the promises and conditions of that covenant, especially that great article of it which is here thrice repeated, because it had been so often inculcated and so much insisted on, that they should not fear other gods. He had told them that, if they kept close to him, he would deliver them out of the hand of all their enemies. Verse 39, yet when they were in the hand of their enemies, and stood in need of deliverance, they were so stupid, and had so little sense of their own interest, that they did after the former manner. Verse 40, they served both the true God and false gods, as if they knew no difference. Ephraim is joined to idols, let him alone. So they did, and so did the nations that succeeded them. Well, might the apostle ask, what then, are we better than they? No, in no wise, for both Jews and Gentiles are all under sin. Romans 3 verse 9.